Are we doing, Cheryl? Is that the majority
Yeah,
of the people?
no, we're still waiting on a few more people to attend. So if you want to just maybe give it a couple of minutes, we've currently got 24 on, but I think we were expecting quite a few more than that. So morning, everybody. Just bear with us while we just admit people to the meeting. They're coming in thick and fast at the minute.
So that's a flurry now, isn't it?
Yeah.
It is dead on 10 o'clock. Well, my machine's just sort of made the noise, you know, that it's 10 o'clock.
Okay. Up to 36 on now. And still coming in.
What were the final numbers, Alison? Did you know?
It was about 80, I think, wasn't it, Josh? I mean, I looked yesterday.
Just double check now, 2 seconds. Just to let everybody know, this meeting is currently being recorded. Yes, it was about 80.
There's another little flurry.
Okay, we're up to 44. Oh, and still coming.
Perhaps we should start in a minute and then we can just let people in as they come, can't we? Do you think?
Yeah, that's fine.
We've got 53 in now. I can see now it's stopped flashing.
Okay, then, so we'll make a start. I think it's 3 minutes past 10. I think we've got the majority of people in the meeting. We'll just keep admitting as they arrive. Good morning, everybody. My name is Justin Bridges, and I'm the head of pensions at Shropshire Council. And I'd like to welcome you all to this year's employers meeting. To start off with, I would just like to provide a quick team update. Many of you will have met Debbie Sharp, our pensions admin manager, who's worked for Shropshire for over 40 years. She has recently taken up a new position at South Yorkshire Pension Authority and started out on the 6th of November. So we'd like to wish Debbie all the best in her new role and thank her for all the many years of service at Shropshire. Just to let you all know that we have successfully recruited to the pension admin manager position someone who has over 25 years LGPS experience and worked for Shropshire County Pension Fund before for over 20 years with Debbie and her team. Her name is Vicky Jenks and she is currently the pension admin manager at Warwickshire Pension Fund. Due to notice periods, etc., she's due to start at the fund on the 19th of December. So we all look forward to welcoming Vicky back to the team. Many of you would have attended the employers meeting last year, and it's good to see so many of you again. I think the main focus last year was on the 2022 actuarial valuation. This year, the main focus of the presentations today will be on the McLeod remedy, which has now come into legislation. And it will cover an update from Mercer on the background to this and how this will impact on the fund, employers and individual LGPS members. There will also be an update on the importance of employers submitting accurate data, an introduction to pensions dashboards, and an update on some current issues, including cybersecurity, pension tax limit changes, and governance issues, to name a few. Presentations will last around about an hour and a half, and there's no break planned. After each section, Mark and Jonathan from Mercer will pause to take any questions. So hopefully everybody should be familiar by now with MS Teams, but there is a chat function for anybody that wants to submit a question, and there is also a hands raise function for people that want to ask questions in person. The pensions admin team will monitor all the questions submitted via MS Teams, and the aim is to answer as many of the questions as we can during the meeting. If we can't answer anything, we'll get back to you as soon as we can after the meeting. If I can ask you all, if you haven't already done so, if you can ask you to mute your microphones unless you wanted to ask a question during the presentation. The slides will be sent out. They'll be shared by Mercer as I go through them, but we'll send the slides out to all employers, the ones that attend in the meetings and the ones unable to attend. And I should also tell you all that this meeting has been recorded, so it'll be on our website after the employers meeting, so those that can't attend can watch it as well. There will also be a feedback form that will circulate to you all after the meeting, so I'll be grateful if you could all complete that following the employers meeting, as your feedback is important to us. And hopefully, before I hand over to Mark, I think is kicking off from Mercer on McLeod. Hopefully, we've got a couple of polls that should appear in the chat function. So, Alison, if I can ask you to launch the poll. Hopefully everybody should be able to see it. If not, just put your hand up and raise it, but it should be in the chat function. So if you could just answer that first poll question before Mark kicks off from Mercer, that'd be good. Thank you.
Can you all see that? Because I can see it, but yeah. Can you see the results, Jonathan?
I can't see the results. I can just see the poll at the moment.
So the responses we've got, nothing is 8%, B is 12%, 39% for they've heard of it, not sure about the current position, and 42% understand it well.
Okay, great. I'll start sharing the slides then, and then over to you, Mark.
Excellent. Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Justin. And thanks for everyone for responding for the poll. For those who don't know me, my name is Mark Wilson. I am one of the fund actuaries along with Michelle Dolman, who can't be here today. I'm here with a colleague of mine, another colleague, Jonathan Pereira, who advises the fund around governance and benefits. A lot of the things we're discussing today are actually his area of expertise, which is my way of saying he'll be answering any difficult questions that you have. You move on to the next slide, please, Jonathan. So the agenda for today is as Justin's outlined. Firstly, I'm going to go through McLeod in some detail. Then we'll touch on the importance of data to the fund's operations. I'll do a little bit on pensions dashboards, and then we'll finish up with some current issues, things that are going on that you might need to be aware of. So I'll move firstly into the McLeod section. So from the poll, around 20% of you have either never heard of McLeod or know very little. So firstly, let me say that I envy you. And secondly, I'm sorry, I'm about to ruin your day, I'm afraid. Those of us in the pensions world have been dealing with this for a significant amount of our working lives for about 6 or 7 years now, something like that. It's having quite a material impact on some of the fund's operations. So for you, I'm hoping to give you a little bit of background today. And for those of you who are more familiar, hopefully we'll pad out your knowledge and let you know where the fund currently sits and what's happening right now. So firstly, a little bit of background for those who are unaware of what McLeod is and what the issue is. So going back to the early part of the 2010s, the government updated all of the public sector schemes, including the LGPS. The idea of this, the driver, was to reduce the overall cost of public sector pensions, as well as making things a little bit fairer. Now, whether that's ultimately been achieved, given everything that's happened since, is a bit of a question mark, but that was the intention at the time. To do this, they made a few changes. The first key one was they moved the scheme from being what's known as a traditional final salary scheme, where your pension is based on your final pay and the number of years you've worked, to a career average scheme, where it's based on the pay you earn in each year, adjusted for inflation. Now that acts to reduce the costs because on average inflation will increase less than people's pay over the long term, and so there's some savings there for the government. Secondly, they increase the retirement age to be in line with state pension age. Again, people retire later, that reduced the cost to the government. Against that, they actually changed the accrual rates in the favours of the member. So what happened is, in a given year, the amount of pension people earned was actually higher, but it would increase less quickly and it would be payable from a later age. And overall, that was designed to reduce costs to the government of public sector pensions. Now, within that, there was a concern that certain members, the older members in particular, who were closer to retirement, could be adversely affected and not have enough time to adjust their retirement expectations, incomes, and so it was felt that some protection was needed. So what was ruled was that for people who were in the scheme as at the 1st of April 2012, and at that point were within 10 years of retirement, they would get some protections under the new scheme. Essentially, the protections were they would get the better of the old and the new scheme. So at the point they retire, you calculate the pension under the old approach, pension under the new approach, and you give them the best of the two, so that they are not made worse off by these changes relatively close to retirement. The issue with this is that potentially it opened the door for age discrimination claims, because that second criteria B up there, is obviously age related. It only applies, it's only available to older members. So if we move on, Jonathan. And of course, having opened the door, someone walked through it. In this case, it was a judge by the name of MacLeod and also a firefighter. The name doesn't particularly matter because they lost the battle for naming rights. It's not called Sergeant, although that was the name. It's called MacLeod, and that's how it's known. They challenged the scheme for being age discriminatory, and of course, they won. Unsurprising, the judge won the legal case against the government and caused the scheme to have to be effectively rewritten. The result was that the government had to come up with some sort of a remedy that removed this age discrimination and made the scheme fair to all people, legally compliant and so forth. And they had to do that across all of the public sector schemes, which if you think about it is an absolutely huge undertaking. There's quite a few different public sector schemes. They were all different before the remedy came in, before these changes. The changes they brought in 2014-15 were all different. So you've got a huge number of different schemes, which the government now had to marry up, make all compliant with each other, internally at least, and make them all consistent with the law. So it's been quite an enormous undertaking for the government and for everyone involved. So to give you a bit of timeline, firstly, on the left, we have the legals. So it was back in December 2018 when these protections were found unlawful. The government appealed at the time. They didn't agree with this. They didn't agree with the interpretation. They went to the Supreme Court, where unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, they lost again in 2019. At that point, the government accepted the position. They accepted the need to do something to correct all this. In July 2020, they did an initial consultation on a proposed remedy. We use the phrase remedy. That's what it's been called. Essentially, it's a fix of the scheme to make it legal and age compliant. Then earlier this year, we had a further consultation around the details of the proposed remedy, and that's where we stand on the legals. If you can bring up the next part, Johnny. On the right here, we've got the key dates as far as implementation goes. So these are the key dates to know for the operation of things going forwards. So 1st of April 2012, if you're a member of the LGPS or another qualifying public sector scheme at that point, you're potentially affected by these protections, by this ruling, by the remedy. The actual schemes changed on the 1st of April 2014. So this is the start of the period that was meant to be covered by the protections that were originally in place. That period ended 31 March, 2022. So that is your protection period. Then from 1st of April 2022, everyone was into the new scheme. A couple of other dates. From October this year, the remedy, as it's been proposed, is now law. It's something the funds have to comply with, deal with, and abide by, and it's something the funds are all trying to now work out exactly how to do and put all the systems in place. From 31 August 2025, at that point, the fund need to actually start including the impact of MacLeod on members' benefits. So by that point, they have to know, or at least have an estimate of the potential impact of the remedy on all the members. I'll come back onto that more a little later. So actually, what is the proposed remedy? What is the fix for all this? It's a funny one, really, because there's loads and loads of fine detail and it gets very complicated, but at a high level, it's quite simple. So the way it was, there was two elements to the protections. You had to be in a qualifying scheme 1st of April 2012, and you had to be within 10 years of retirement at that date. So essentially, all the government did is they just removed that second qualification. So instead of just applying to older members, now everyone gets protection over that 8-year period, excuse me. So anyone who is in a scheme that qualifies at 1 April 2012, they've got benefits in the period 2014 to 2022, and they were under 65 at that point. They haven't left the scheme for any extended period. Anyone who meets those criteria will potentially benefit from or potentially be impacted by this remedy. Now, the point highlighted is quite important to note. The actual impact of this isn't going to be known for many years. Because the nature of the underpin is it's the old scheme, which is based on your final salary, so you can't actually know how it will affect a member until they leave service in some way, whether they retire, transfer to another scheme, whatever it may be. So the actual cost of this, the actual impact of it is going to rumble on for many years, long after I and all the other presenters here have probably retired. The scheme will still be unpicking it. So we don't know what the exact impact will be in terms of cost, in terms of administration effort and all those sorts of things. But we do know it's going to be quite extensive and it's going to carry on for a number of years. But I just now want to take a look at the actual benefits before and after, just to highlight a couple of points around the underpin and how it actually works, this protection. So these are the different tranches of benefits in the scheme, ignoring the underpin before this ruling in effect. So up to 2008, members had the kind of old style traditional DB pension, the 80th accrual, as we call it. Essentially, that was designed to target a pension at retirement, assuming you work your 40 years, of half your final pay. You got a lump sum at retirement, tax-free, of 3 times your pension, and those were the old traditional benefits. That was changed in 2008. They got rid of the lump sum. In return for that, they increased the accrual cost a little bit. So you got a 60th of your pension, of your pay, excuse me, each year instead of an 80th. And that was the tranche from 2008 to 2014. Then at 2014, they brought in the changes we discussed before. So instead of having the old final salary benefits, we moved to the career average CARE scheme. So your pension's now based on 1/49th of your pay each year, increased with inflation to retirement instead of increased with your final salary. Now, once you apply the underpin, the changes you see are up to 2008 benefits are unchanged, so there's no impact at all there. Then the 2008 to 14 tranche is also unchanged, so there's no impact there. The only period impacted is 2014 to 22, the protection period, where all members with qualifying service will get the maximum of the pension they would get under the 2 different schemes. And then from April 2022, again, it's no change. Everyone's in the career average scheme. Now, we show this mainly to illustrate a specific point, which is also covered on this next slide, which is we think that members, and in our experience, this is true, probably have unrealistic expectations here around the potential impact of the remedy. We've encountered members, I'm sure, who think this is going to be like a lottery win. Their pensions are going to double. You know, they can go out and buy a car or retire into the Bahamas or something. And that isn't going to be the case. For the majority of members, the impact here is going to be quite small, and a lot of members will see no impact at all. First reason was highlighted on the previous slide. It only covers one 8-year period of pension. So if you've worked 30 or 40 years, it's only covering 10 or 20% of your pension that's even potentially impacted. So the kind of overall impact is quite limited from that perspective. And if you only worked a much smaller number of years, 8, 10 years, then a bigger percentage of your pension will be impacted, but your actual pension is going to be quite a bit smaller. So for the vast majority of people, we're not going to be talking huge numbers here. Another thing to note is that for a lot of members, actually, they're better off under the new scheme. While it was designed to save costs and money for the government overall, there was also quite a redistribution. And in particular, for people who might be lower paid and don't see as big an increase in the pay across the career, don't get as many promotions, they probably ended up better off under the new scheme anyway. Main reason for that is the change in the accrual cost that I mentioned earlier. So under the old scheme, you got a 60th of your pay each year as a pension, but under the new scheme, you got a 49th. Now, what that means in actual terms is that the pension you earn in a given year at the point you earn it is about 22% higher under the new scheme than it is for the old scheme. And the way that the saving then emerged is that in future years, under the old scheme, it would increase with your final salary, whereas in the new scheme, it would increase with inflation. Inflation is lower, and so gradually, the idea is that 22% gets eroded and the new scheme will become cheaper. But for that to happen, as we say in the second bullet there, over the course of the rest of your career, your pay needs to increase by at least, or needed to increase by at least 22% above inflation, which is actually quite a high bar if you think about particular over the last 10 years, the kind of increases that the governments have given on public sector pay. That's quite a chunk. If someone worked for 15 years, which is quite typical, they might need 1.4 to 1.5% a year above inflation to get any benefit from this. And finally, to point out there as well, that's just to break even. So you need to claw back that 22% just to break even. If you're going to get a significant benefit from this, you have to have increases quite a bit more than 22% above inflation. So it's a high bar and a lot of people won't be impacted. That said, there are some costs and some people will see benefits from this. Who will that be? For example, obviously those who receive large pay rises, either people who get a one-off big promotion, a big chunk pay rise, or high flyers who get a lot of promotions through their careers, they will certainly benefit. Also, potentially younger members. Younger members might or have the potential to stay in the scheme for longer, and so those pay increases can just gradually build up and erode kind of the difference between inflation, and it builds up gradually and can bite that way. Although, of course, for younger members, if they do that, bringing it back to the earlier point, you'll find that only a small portion of their overall benefits will be covered by this remedy. If we move on to the next slide, please. A lot of members will want to know, what is the impact now? As I've said, there may be some quite unrealistic expectations here. So you may find that your employees are contacting you and asking you what will be the impact on them. They've certainly been contacting the fund as well, wanting to know the impact. To stress the point from earlier, the impact can't be known until the members leave. So the best they could hope for at this point is some sort of estimate, and it probably wouldn't be a particularly useful one, particularly if you're a long way from retirement. Now, from 2025, as I've said, funds will need to include something on benefit statements. So at that point, they will be able to provide information to all members of the scheme to some degree. However, at the current point, the fund is not able to provide any estimates to your members, to your active employees. There's a variety of issues there, mainly just around getting all the infrastructure in place. I'll come on to this in a little bit later, but it's a huge change to the way the fund operates. There's enormous data requirements, and so there's a lot of work that needs to be done behind the scenes to make this work. And so currently the fund is not able to provide any estimates of the impact of this to your individual members. And that's with good reason, as I say, the requirements, and also it would be counterproductive to provide estimates before we've got everything in place. Better to make sure it's done properly and in good time and in an orderly manner. Now, for the non-active members, your former employees, your deferred members and your pensioners, these would probably come direct to the fund, and the fund would deal with them. Now, they are less likely to be impacted by this because they're no longer working, so they're no longer getting pay increases that might drive a potential cost here. That said, the fund can't provide these members with estimates right now either, for similar reasons, putting the systems in place, dealing with all the regulations and requirements that go with this. So once this is a little bit further along, they'll be able to address these members as well. There's actually a priority order for dealing with the members, which has been provisionally laid out by government, subject to consultation and confirmation, but this is the way it sits at the moment. So the first cases to be dealt with will be the new retirees, new deaths, new transfers after the regulations came into effect in October 23. The idea is to get it first working for the new cases as they arrive. The second priority group is people who retired, left the scheme, died, deferred members before 2023. So that's effectively looking back and retrospectively correcting cases that have already occurred, where they left the scheme before the remedy was in place and before we knew the impact. And then the third and final tranche is everything else, which will include all of your current active employees. So provisionally, that's how the cases will be dealt with. So now I just want to give a couple of examples to just illustrate why for most people it won't have an impact, because it might be counterintuitive in some cases. And then we'll move on to some examples of cases where this will actually have an impact and those who might be affected. So in the left-hand column, we've got your average member, typical member for the scheme, pay of £30,000 a year. That results in a pension under the new scheme, the career average, with the higher accrual, a pension of £612. The underpin pension is much lower, £500, that 22% difference that I talked about before. So if we assume they stay in the scheme for 15 years to retirement, let's say, and their pay increases are about 1.25% above inflation on average, which is the actuarial assumption we make as part of the valuation, then when they hit retirement, the pension under the new scheme is £954. The underpin pension is less than that. It doesn't bite, and so this member is unimpacted, certainly for that year of service, so they don't get anything extra from the remedy. For this member, as I said before, for them to get any impact, they'd need to get typically at least 1.4, 1.5% a year above inflation. So then if we look at the next column, we've got a younger member. You might think a younger member might be more impacted by this because they're in the scheme for longer, more pay increases. And while that is possible, typically it wouldn't necessarily be the case, because what you find is that while younger people have potentially more exposure and more time in the scheme, they're also more likely to move jobs and move careers. So there's also a bigger chance that they will actually leave the scheme before retirement. So for them, we might look at a typical period in the scheme of being around about 17 years. Now, if we assume the same pay increases, 1.25% above inflation, then what happens is over the 17 years, that little bit of a longer period, for this member, the underpin bites very slightly, and essentially they get an extra £5. Now that is £5 a year as a pension for kind of 1 year of service. So they are getting something, but it's biting very little. It's not doing very much for that person at all. Then thirdly, we've got an older member on the right, higher pay and higher pension, as you might expect, but they've only got 5 years until they retire. So for them, those additional pay increases, 1.25% a year above inflation, it's not even close to making the underpin bite, and the pension under the new scheme is quite a lot higher than the underpin. For them, for an older member, they'd need to earn really big pay increases, like 4% a year, every year above inflation before they start to see anything from this. So for the older members, it's quite hard to make this bite. That said, here are some cases where you would see an impact. So in the first case, we've got your average member again, but now they're getting higher pay increases. They've done a little better in their career, maybe a promotion or two in there. So they're getting on average another 0.5% a year in terms of pay increases across the whole of the career. So now with that extra earnings, you do find that the underpin bites. This member gets another £50 a year, which is about an extra 10% on the pension for that particular year. So they are starting to see something from that. Second column, we've got a younger member again, but this time they are staying in the scheme until they retire. So they're doing a full 30 years, let's say. Over that period, those extra pay increases, they start to really ramp up, and this person does get quite an impact. And this is probably generally where you'll see it the most, younger people who do stay in the scheme. So they're actually getting another £216, so almost another 20% on top of the pension for these particular circumstances. And then here you've got your older member, as before, similar increases, but in this case, they're also getting a big one-off pay increase. You can see this with older members as they get more experienced, they get a significant promotion to reflect that experience towards the end of their career. And this can actually have a significant impact. In this case, it bumps up the underpin cost by quite a degree and actually gets you to the point where the underpin is biting. So they get an extra £44, £45 a year, so another 4 or 5% on top of their pension. So these are just examples of potential scenarios, and there are others, but it gives you a feel for the sort of cases where you might see an impact. Okay, so that covers members in some detail and how they might be impacted. So now I'll take a minute to look at how employers might be impacted. I should probably say as an aside that it's a little unfortunate, really, more than a little unfortunate, because none of this is the employer's fault. You didn't kind of design the scheme. None of the changes were you're doing, and you didn't really get much of a say in them. But you will unfortunately have to pick up the costs that arise. As I say, it's unfair, but it's a legal ruling, and this is just unfortunately the way it is. That said, For most employers, the impact will be generally quite small because of all the reasons I've just discussed on the previous slides. A lot of members not impacted or not impacted very much. That said, you will find some employers do have a bigger impact. Typically, these might be, firstly, you've got your smaller employers where individual members can have a bigger impact. So if you think about a large employer like a council, there the impacts would very much average out. So you get the odd person who's a real high flyer, a lot of pay increases. You get a few people who get that one big bump. You get some young people who stay the course. But then you get a lot of people who that doesn't happen for, all averages out to quite a low and quite a predictable cost. But for small employers, one member can have a much bigger impact because you might find that 20%, 25% of your total exposure to the scheme, your total assets and liabilities sits with one member. So if that member gets a big pay increases, if they do well, if they stay in the scheme for longer than expected, then that can lead to quite a big cost, even at the employer level. Then we've got those with less active members. So as I said before, this mainly affects the active members. Your former members, your deferreds and pensioners who you're still responsible for, their benefits aren't linked to pay, so the underpin is less likely to bite. So what you'll find is employers with a lot of active members, they might be disproportionately affected because there's more pay increases going on relative to the size of your overall exposure to the scheme. And then, as you might expect, there's of course those who are awarding significantly above inflation pay increases. That has an impact for the reasons we've already discussed, of course. So at the 2022 valuation, we looked at all this. It was incorporated into everyone's results. So your results, your contributions that you pay now, they allow for the McLeod remedy, as we currently understand it, and as it's been set out in the law. So it's all now fully included. The impact overall was fairly small. It added around 1% to liabilities on average across the fund, which is equivalent to knocking roughly 1% off your funding level assets relative to liabilities. For most employers, 3/4, it was less than 2% of liabilities, with a few employers who saw bigger impacts for the reasons discussed in the bullets above. In terms of what this means for your contributions, what you're actually paying to the fund, there's no impact on your primary contributions. Those are the percentage contributions in respect of new benefits being earned every day. The underpin doesn't apply to service at this point. It stopped at 2020, so there's no impact. There is an impact, on your secondary contributions, which are in respect of any surplus or deficit. This averaged out across the scheme as a whole at around about 0.6% of pay, and for 80% of employers, it was less than 1% of pay. So the impact overall on contributions for most employers is quite small. Now, I understand that in current times, even 1% of pay is quite difficult, and it's a headache a lot of employers don't need. But in terms of overall contributions, we're not talking huge differences due to this compared to what you otherwise would have been paying. And there'll only be very few isolated cases where it gets really significant. So I've alluded to this already, but what are the additional data requirements for implementing the remedy? They're quite significant. Again, once you drill into the detail, there's a lot going on there. You can summarize it at a high level quite well though. Under the new scheme, the idea was that the main thing the fund would need to know was how much you earned every year, how much pay you got, because it was a career average pay driven scheme. Under the old scheme, and so under the underpin, under the remedy, you actually need to know how much work people have done. So how many years were in the scheme, what kind of work they were doing in terms of periods and so forth. You can see that on the right hand side there, the key data requirements. So the stuff at the top, your pay, your leaving date, and your date join the scheme. This is standard information the fund would look to hold anyway. But the stuff at the bottom is what they really weren't supposed to need when the new scheme was introduced. So your hours history and your kind of service breaks. So if you think about that, that's quite a demanding thing to know. Sounds easy enough. At a high level, all you need to do is tell the fund what period your employees worked. But once you drill into it, it's a lot less simple than that. When did they start? When did they end? Were they part-time for any period? Because if you're part-time, you accrue less benefits. So if you only work in half a year, then you only accrue half as much pension in a particular year as you would have if you worked full-time. So you need to know everyone's part-time service periods, for which some employees, there'll be quite a few different changes. You've got to know all about the changes. The fund needs to know about any breaks in service for any reason. And were they genuine breaks? Were they related to sickness, maternity? Do they need to be counted for pension purposes or not? So a lot of detail is needed there. Other relevant information, where there were service breaks, did employees look to buy that service back in any way? And if they did they complete the contract? So when you drill into this, there's a lot of information requirements for the fund, and they're quite onerous and they're quite tricky to get. It's probably a lot more demanding than it would have been under the new scheme, where the information would have been all around pay. And of course, now the fund needs to have both to make the underpin work. So data-wise, it's really demanding for the fund. Which brings us to, what is the fund doing now to kind of implement the remedy? What is the fund's approach? This is where you're in quite a good position compared to other funds. I should probably say generally that the admin at Shropshire is very, very good. It's as good as we see when we work around the LGPS, and that extends to this issue here. Now, the fund has been collecting a lot of the data that's needed, even though it wasn't supposed to be needed throughout the underpin period and probably beyond. So in terms of the data already held, Shropshire is a step or two in front of a lot of funds already, so you're in quite a good position here. That said, there's still a lot of work to do, because while the data was being held, it wasn't necessarily being used to set benefits. So it's become a lot more important now. So it needs to be, excuse me, reviewed and verified, checked for reasonableness. So there's a lot of work to be done there. The fund is currently doing that. So they've been working with us to look at the data overall for McLeod compliance at a fund level, and also drilling down to individual employers. So they've been doing assessments of the data they hold for different employers, doing a review, identifying any holes, issues, grading it, and where necessary, deciding on plans to correct this. So many of you will have received some sort of communication from the fund, letting you know that this is going on, summarising what's been done. And in some cases where there are issues, they'll have contacted you and asked you for additional data, additional information. Where that's happened, I'd strongly ask you to please comply with those requirements, because again, it's very important for the fund to have this, primarily to make sure that the members get the right benefits as they're entitled to under the law, because if they don't and it emerges later, it can mean additional costs for the fund. And it's also important for you as employers, because if the correct benefits aren't recorded, you end up with the wrong liabilities, you end up paying the wrong contributions, and that can need to be corrected later, leading to one-off costs, changes, and issues for yourselves. So it's to the benefit of everyone, employer and fund and employees, that all of this is sorted out as efficiently and quickly as possible. So please engage with the fund when they ask in terms of data provision and things they might need. So finally, I'll just touch on some other considerations which the fund is dealing with and which might potentially affect you in some ways, or possibly your members. So firstly, there's software. Obviously, there's a lot of work to be done on the software side. The fund is working with the software and administration providers, excuse me, to get the software up and running. There's various different new rules now that weren't there before. They've also all got to be built into the software, to the underlying subroutines, to make sure that all the calculations that come out of that are correct. And it's quite a significant piece of work to update all that software. So that's currently ongoing. As it notes there, some cases may not be able to be processed automatically, and so the fund will need to consider routines to deal with that as well. It's also a big communication challenge. We've touched on some of the issues today, particularly around members and managing expectations, as well as dealing with all the other stakeholders, as I've mentioned, the software providers, helping yourselves as well with all your inquiries and queries, dealing with the internal infrastructure of the fund committee, making sure everyone's up to date, understands what is being done and what needs to be done going forward. So it's a significant communication effort. Potential impacts as well for tax paid in the past. The current position is that when assessing taxation, the remedy will be ignored and it'll be based on the new scheme in effect, but in the past that may not have always been the case. So there may be some cases where members may have potentially overpaid tax, and that might need to be reviewed and looked at, and potential corrections there. And finally, there are other issues. For those who don't know, the government does a regular cost management exercises for public sector schemes, where they look at the cost of the scheme and they adjust the benefits to make sure the costs stay reasonable, whether that benefit adjustment needs to be an increase or a decrease. There's currently a legal wrangle about whether the costing should include McLeod or not. That's going to be resolved hopefully in January with a judicial review. So depending on the outcome of that, it may then feed into the cost management exercise, which in turn might feed into in-time scheme benefits. So it really is the gift that just keeps on giving. So that's it on the McLeod section. So we'll pause now for any questions, if there are any, Alison.
No, Mark, I can't see any. Can you see any, Cheryl?
Okay, in that case.
No, nothing coming in.
Sorry,
hopefully everybody can add to the, if they can't add into the chat, there's the Q&A option at the top as well that questions can be put to if people are struggling.
Okay, excellent. In that case, then we'll move on to the next section, which is around the importance of data. If you do think of any questions around McLeod, there will be time at the end as well. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Just before we go into this section on member data and employer data, Alison, are you okay to run the second poll, please?
Yeah, I'll just launch that now.
I need to stop sharing for you to do that.
Can you see that?
I can see it, Alison.
I'll stop sharing just in case.
Oh, interestingly, a third and a third and a third. So yeah, that's quite interesting, isn't it? So we got 30% said yes, 37 no, and 33 maybe.
Okay, thank you. Hi, good morning, everybody. So just taking over from Mark for this next section where we'll talk about the importance of member data and also some employer data, so it'll be pertinent to yourselves. But first of all, if we just take a sort of a step back on this slide and sort of why data is important. So back to basics, really. The primary responsibility of the pension fund is to ensure that member benefits are paid correctly as and when they fall due. And we can see here from sort of this illustrative chart, a typical sort of cash flow profile for an LGPS fund in terms of the benefits payable to active members, deferred members, and pensioner members based on benefits accrued to date. And when we talk about liabilities in the pension funds, Mark's mentioned a couple of times already, essentially, when we calculate the liabilities for you as employers as part of a valuation process or other employer event, that's effectively the present value or the discounted value of all the benefit payments associated with your members. So again, everything all links back to member benefits. Hence, none of this could be done really without having the correct data from yourselves as employers to administer those benefits, and then that obviously feeds into the work that we do, and also in other areas. So we're just going to look at this slide here, really, a sort of potential situation where maybe incorrect data is provided to the fund and what the implications of that may be on the member's benefit. We've just taken a sample member here, a male member who has 6 years of service on the 60th accrual. So that's effectively the 2008 to 2014 benefit that Mark illustrated earlier. Full-time pay, giving us a final salary benefit of 21,900 and ultimately a pension of 2,190 for that member. However, if in the returns provided by employers there was a transposition in that pay figure and it came through as 29,100, it can be seen there obviously that benefit jumps up to £2,910, which is a 30% increase and potentially then a wrong benefit paid to that member. And some people may think, well, that's quite good for the member getting a higher benefit. But of course, over time, that would probably need to be corrected. And then obviously there's issues then with having to adjust those benefits, recover potential overpayments, and obviously member expectations impacted alongside. So what the fund attempts to do then really is sort of undertake regular data validation exercises, at least on an annual basis. But typically that's with this day and age, with the continuous data flow from employees to the fund, it's done more frequently. And they try to identify these issues before they arise and sort of have those corrections coming back to yourselves with any particular flags that may come through in the data validation. It's important, therefore, for the fund to engage with employers like they are doing today through the sessions today, and just to sort of reiterate those messages around the importance of having data provided to the fund. And one of the common reasons that issues arise with data provision and causes sort of the fund to ask questions back to employers is when members are absent, and the fund does need to know the reason for that absence so it can be recorded correctly and the appropriate benefits set up. So maybe sickness, maternity, but the fund does need to know about those data changes. So that's one of the key areas really in terms of data provision and having that data flow between yourselves as employers and the fund. And of course, at the moment, there's a lot more external scrutiny for funds to adhere to in terms of data provision from employers and reporting. And we'll come on to talk a little bit about that in another slide. Where else is data used? Obviously, we've mentioned first and foremost is to pay the right benefits to members, but there's the actuarial valuation exercise that Mark as the actuary will undertake alongside Michelle. And obviously that then feeds into the contributions that you pay as employers into the fund. And then we'll see on the next slide an example of how that may impact in terms of incorrect data provision. Accounting exercises. I'm not too sure of all the employee names on the call today, but many of you will probably receive accounting schedules from the fund for your own accounts. And again, any sort of incorrect data provision along the way can lead to an impact on your potential balance sheet, and obviously maybe errors in the audit process that need to be resolved. Benefit statements in the pensions dashboard. Mark will cover off a bit more detail about pensions dashboard in the next section. But member benefit statements that are issued every year, obviously that's impacting on the members' expectations of what they might get in the future and their retirement planning. And again, therefore, the importance of correct data being provided to the fund to run those exercises and not lead to any sort of members expecting higher benefits or potentially lower benefits than they will actually get. In terms of tax, again, on an annual basis, the fund will carry out potential checks to see if members have exceeded any sort of annual allowance limits in terms of the benefits they accrue during the year. And where they do exceed those limits, there's potential tax charges to come through. So again, highlighting the importance of having the correct data to go through that process. External scrutiny we've talked about in terms of the pensions regulated data scoring, external reviews from the Scheme Advisory Board, the Government Actuary Department. There's a lot more focus on data across the LGPS, not just for the Shropshire Fund and all other public sector pension schemes, and having sort of that data quality scored, assessed, reported. So it's important in that sense again that the fund is shown to sort of be on top of this. And as Mark's mentioned, the Shropshire Fund is probably one of the better funds that we deal with in terms of the LGPS clients, in terms of that administration and data quality and the work that is being done by the team. And again, rectification. Unfortunately, as Mark's mentioned with the McLeod exercise, there's a lot of data needed to go back in certain instances to sort of rectify benefits when changes come through in regulation. So again, having that clean, complete data set provided by yourselves as employers is very important. Just going back to sort of the liability point in terms of the potential impact on yourselves as employers from data. Returning to that example we had before of the member, where the pay was provided as a higher pay figure. For example, if that came through for an actuarial valuation for ourselves, the benefit that we would value would be higher because of the pay figure. And essentially then that would lead to a higher liability coming through on your balance sheet as an employer. And we can see here it's sort of 44,000 to 58,000 for this one particular member. Now, of course, that might not look that big in the grand scheme of things. But if this happened across a number of members in the fund, or as a small employer with a few members and 2 or 3 had issues with the pay data provided, then obviously that can lead then to a much higher liability coming through for that employer, and potentially then in terms of the valuation outcomes and the certified rates that Mark and Michelle will produce, higher contributions. So actually there is a direct impact of incorrect data potentially in the pounds that you will pay into the fund. And again, similarly, if it wasn't a pay figure that was incorrect, but the member's gender that came back through for some reason, then again that can have an impact there, going from 58 to 60. So a small increase, but an increase nonetheless. So where we do see missing or maybe inconsistent data in evaluation data provision, or in a provision of data for other exercises where we need to calculate liabilities, There'll be certain instances where we do go back to the fund and query this, but in other cases, we will make prudent estimates of that missing data. Those estimates, of course, being on the prudent side, could result still in increased liabilities and increased contributions, like we've said. Where data is provided that's understated, and it may not necessarily be massively understated, but still an understatement, then the liabilities could emerge actually lower for that particular employer at a valuation exercise, and therefore sort of lower contributions than necessary paid into the fund. But once that issue maybe is corrected, say that maybe it's part of the next valuation or another exercise where the correct pay data or the correct service data is provided, that then can lead to a big jump in the liabilities for that employer, and potentially then a jump in contributions to rectify that issue. And of course, as we know, budgets are tight for employers, so a spike in contributions coming through for data provision can be at an inopportune time for yourselves. And this can happen quite a lot in terms of the career average scheme, where the pay coming back from employers is maybe only the basic pay only and doesn't involve any sort of pensionable elements on top, so for overtime, etc. And then that's where the fund can sometimes see those sort of fluctuations in the pay data coming through and corrections of previous pay data provided, which then obviously has knock-on effects. As I've said, we do work with the fund around these exercises to try and flag the most significant areas that will have an impact on the liabilities and contributions. We don't necessarily query everything because it'll be probably impractical to do so. So for a council employer, say, if there are 3 or 4 pay figures that we don't think are quite correct for evaluation, we would probably just make an estimate of those pay figures rather than return into the fund for 3 or 4 members in a large council, because the overall impact wouldn't be that significant. But where there's a pattern of pay figures or there's a pattern of service or something else within that data, then we will liaise with the fund accordingly as part of valuation exercises. And in particular for smaller employers where there is that potential for that contribution to be impacted. It's a continuous exercise in terms of data quality for the fund as a whole, but obviously does require your support as employers in getting that data across to the fund correctly, on time, etc. Not just evaluation exercise and potential contributions where data can have an impact, but obviously accounting exercises. Again, there'll be, as I said, there'll be some employees on today's session who do get regular accounting schedules from us at the year end. So this sort of layout here shouldn't be too much of a surprise to you. But again, we rely on data being provided by the fund to process these calculations, and some of that data will obviously have come direct from yourselves as employers. So if there are events that have taken place during the year, or there are sort of incorrect pay figures coming through, then this can lead to sort of additional queries coming through at the audit stage, potential reruns of schedules to correct for those data issues, and therefore that may lead to additional costs, which are then obviously come back to yourselves as employers in the recharge process. So again, just repeating those messages, it's all relevant data provided by yourselves to the fund on time, and of course correct, to ensure that what information that we then produce on the back of that is also correct. So the fund does have a pensions administration strategy statement, and hopefully some of you on the call today, or all of you on the call, will be familiar with this. The link to that statement is there on the fund's website. And this does contain a lot of detail in terms of the responsibilities for yourselves as employers, in terms of what data you need to provide to the fund, and when, in a number of different scenarios involving starters, changing circumstances, those sicknesses and absences that we talked about, for the valuation, transfers of staff in bulk out of the fund in terms of outsourcings, and of course retirements, leavers, deaths, etc. So I would sort of encourage you to become familiar with the processes in here and the responsibilities on you as employers, because that will only help your understanding and obviously help with that timely provision of data to the fund in relation to sort of member benefit calculations, etc. It's not just about member data where your responsibilities lie. Obviously, a key part of the operations of the fund is the data about yourselves as an employer and in an organisation. And again, the fund has a policy statement online in terms of an employer events policy. The link to that is below. And this contains, again, information about what you should be providing to the fund as an employer. And there are certain instances where you would be required, or the fund will request, that you notify them of the changes to your situation over potentially, say, on an ongoing basis. That can include significant events that impact your covenant, your ability to pay contributions into the fund. That's something that may have happened, impacting your financial covenant and stability. There may be significant events impacting your liabilities that the fund needs to be aware of. The main one of these is obviously transfers of staff to a different employer in the fund, and what you need to do as part of that process, and the information that you need to provide. So therefore the fund can then undertake the relevant activities. And even just basic details such as sort of employer contact details, if there's members of your organisation who the fund will typically contact and they're absent for any reason or leave for any reason, it's important that that continuous flow of information with the fund can take place, and there isn't time spent trying to chase somebody up for contact details or emails bouncing back if that contact has left the organisation. So not just those significant sort of liability related events, but just that sort of the basic details about yourselves as an employer. So again, would recommend you become familiar with what's in the sort of the employer events policy that is online, which sets out those situations you need to notify the fund. Just going back to the poll question we sort of set out at the start of this section, in terms of there's around probably a sort of a third split in terms of what is required of an employer as part of an outsourcing process, where you may let a contract to a caterer, a cleaner, etc. What is needed from yourselves as part of that process to make sure everything goes through on time and correctly. So there are different parties involved in that process. That yourselves potentially as the parent authority or the employer letting that contract, the fund who needs to sort of know about that, ourselves, Mercer, to sort of establish the initial contribution rate, any potential bonds or risks that need to be assessed for the new employer coming through. There's legal documents that need to be implemented, the admission agreements or a bond agreement, etc. And of course, there's the new employer as well, who actually needs to know their obligations to the fund, what they need to pay and when, etc. So here is an example of an ideal scenario in that sense of the different stages in that process and the different sort of parties that will be responsible for each of those stages. Now, again, an ideal scenario from start to finish of sort of, but I think it's safe to say probably that this doesn't happen in a lot of instances. And we see, not just from yourselves, but in other funds as well, that the fund is sometimes the last to know about some of these instances where an outsourcing has taken place and a contract has been let, and then sometimes it can become a race against time to get the documentation through in time, to get the calculations through in time. And whilst admission agreements can be backdated, it's important really to try and avoid that where possible and have everything in place in a timely manner for these contracts that come through. So again, for those of you who maybe aren't that familiar with your obligations here, there'll be information included in the employer events policy about what to notify the fund and the administration strategy. And again, there's the officers on the call today and your general sort of contacts with the fund. By all means, reach out to them and ask for support if you're unsure of what you should do in these instances. So again, just to repeat those messages, it's employer engagement, communication, and sort of the timely provision of data, not just member data, but instances like this as well, where there are new employees coming into the fund, and the fund needs to be aware of that. Okay, so that's just the end of that section there. So just pause again for any questions on member data and employer data. Alison, Cheryl, is anything coming through at the moment?
No, I can't see anything, I'm afraid.
No questions come through. Can I just pick up a point though, please, Jonathan, if you don't mind?
Sure.
Just to sort of reiterate the case, obviously, with any outsourcings, let us know as soon as possible. As Jonathan's just said, that does give us problems if we don't know about them. And then also with the data, the thing that we find when we're looking at data at the end of the year is where you've had somebody on an absence and they've gone on to reduce pay, and you haven't implemented your assumed pensionable pay. So I think we've talked about this in past employer webinars. If you're not sure what to do when somebody goes on to a reduced pay for sickness or no pay, or for a reduced pay maternity absence or other parental absence, just reach out to us, give us a shout, and we can talk through how you need to deal with that and how you need to put that data through the iConnect system so that we don't end up with the incorrect pay on people's records. That is usually our main area. Other than that, we do get very good data, so just an opportunity to thank employers on the call for that and for working with us and for sending iConnect returns through on time, which does happen for about 99% of employers. We get a very good response, so just an opportunity for me to thank everybody for that. But just a reminder on your assumed pensionable pay, please don't forget about it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Cheryl. So I'll before I just pass back to Mark to sort of cover a bit on the dashboards. Alison, could you run the next poll on dashboards, please?
I'll just launch that one now.
It's quite interesting to watch this live coming in. It's like election night.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's quite good. So what we're seeing is most people have heard of them, with a split pretty even between those who are fully aware and those who have a basic awareness but don't know the details. I'll do a brief run through now to give some background and hopefully bring those who aren't very familiar up to speed. So we just move on to the first slide, please, Johnny. So pensions dashboards, what are they? It's a very good idea at a high level. Essentially, it will be an electronic service, a kind of one-stop shop where members will be able to log in with an online provider and they'll be able to see literally all of their pensions in one place. Probably two things to say about that. Firstly, I think it's a really good idea. I would say that there's probably, maybe not so much in the LGPS, but certainly in the wider country as a whole, in the nation as a whole, that there's probably quite a few people who aren't very engaged with the pension savings and probably don't have a realistic understanding of what pension they might receive when they retire. And there'll be more than a few people out there who'll receive quite a kind of rude awakening, when they do come to retire and realize that the pension isn't nearly what they expect. So something like this that gives people an easy way to engage with it and will let people know the overall level of benefits encompassing everything is going to be a really useful thing. It's quite a laudable thing, I think, that the government is trying to do here. Against that, it's also a massively huge undertaking. It's incredibly demanding. You get an enormous amount of data from a wide range of sources. It's all got to be pulled together, verified for correctness, put in the same format and displayed on a dashboard that the member can easily look at and understand and engage with. So it's a great thing, but it's kind of very hard to do. So probably worth bearing those two things in mind. How it will work in practice is the member, any member of any pension scheme in the country, will be able to select a dashboard provider. The plan is that there'll be a no-cost access one, but there may be others as well that provide additional services. They'll choose a provider. They'll be able to log into this and they'll be able to see all of their different pensions from all of their different employments across their working life. Worth saying as well, that's becoming more important. Traditionally, as you went back further into the past, people tended to have one job, maybe two, and one or two pensions. Now it's becoming the norm to have 4, 5, 6. So something that pulls them all together will be incredibly valuable for the members. It will also include the state pension, which is quite useful. Firstly, it gives people a fuller understanding of what they'll receive at retirement. Secondly, again, for managing expectations, anyone who thinks that the state pension is going to pick up any slack that the private pension doesn't, again, they'll be able to see whether that is true And again, in cases where it isn't true, and there will be some for sure, it'll give them early warning so they can do something about that, increase the contributions, manage the retirement plans, whatever it may be. So it's useful that the state pension is in there. So in terms of how this works, it was introduced in the Pensions Act in 2021. Now, initially, this was going to go live in, I believe, 2024 for the LGPS. That was the target date, according to my notes. Thankfully, earlier this year, a decision was taken to push that back. And I think that was quite a sensible one. And I think we're all quite relieved by that, because while this is a very useful thing, that's only true if it's done correctly. If it was done wrong, if it was rushed, if it was brought forth before the infrastructure was there, then it could have been counterproductive and give people misleading information, made it harder for them to engage with the pensions and understand what they had. So it's been pushed back now for the LGPS to 2026. And I think that's a very good thing in terms of making sure this is done properly. In terms of the parties involved, obviously there's thousands of pension funds across the country. Essentially, any pension fund that's got any active or deferred members will have to take part in this. It won't cover pensioners because they'll already be in receipt of the pension, but anyone who's got a future pension coming, they'll be a part of this. Jonathan, I've just lost the slide, sorry.
I think we may have lost Jonathan.
I think I may have lost Jonathan.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I'm
not quite sure where he's gone.
I'm more upset about losing the slides, which are more valuable than Jonathan. Let me just see if I can share my screen 1 second. Apologies for this. Hopefully he'll come back. Hopefully you can all see my screen now. Can you all see that?
Yeah,
we can.
Excellent. Okay. Across the bottom there, we can see the other interested parties in this work. So you've got the Pensions Dashboard Programme, who are providing some of the kind of digital infrastructure. Got the Money Pension Service, MAPS as it's called. They're providing the infrastructure for the overall work. They'll be involved within the kind of free dashboard. They'll also be overseeing the complaints process. They're due to put that in place. And then there's other interested parties. We have DWP, obviously, for the state pension. We have the pensions regulator, who's obviously got a say in this, it relating to pensions, pension administration services, all the pension funds, all the potential software providers, all the members. So it's an awful lot of things coming together. And I say this to illustrate the fact that it's a big undertaking. I'll just try and get in the proper slideshow view. Hopefully you can all see this now.
Yeah.
Excellent. So now we're on the slide which shows what will individuals see. So essentially it'll be quite simple. Each member will log on and they'll see details about their schemes, each scheme they have, who the administrator is so they can contact them if need be, the job that gave rise to the pension. Then for each one, they'll have an estimated retirement income and the level of accrued benefit. And then there'll be details around how to find out more. So who can they contact if they want more information here? So it's quite a simple setup, but as I say, there's a huge amount going in the background to make this happen. And here you can see an example of a dashboard. So this is what a member might actually see when they log in. So here you've got all the different schemes. This member's got 6 different pension schemes, which isn't untypical these days. Lists all the different administrators who are looking after those pensions. And you can just imagine how hard it is just to even get those 6 to talk to each other and come together to a kind of common whole. So multiply that up by 1,000 and you can sort of get an idea of what you're dealing with. In the next column, you've got pensions value. Now this relates to defined contribution or cash schemes. These are the schemes where rather than having a pension based on your payroll, it's instead based on how much money you pay in, and then that gets invested and it's worth what it's worth, and that provides you benefits. So those are the values of the members' cash pots. In the next column, there's actual pension amounts. So from your defined benefit schemes at the top, these are the pension amounts. For the defined contribution scheme, it's an estimate of the income that might produce. And then it tells you the date each of those is payable from. So that's when the member can actually look to retire. And then finally, we've got some links where you can find out more. And that'll be available for every member of a pension scheme in the country. But finally, it's worth just taking a look at some of the responsibilities in terms of making this happen. So in terms of your responsibilities as employers, I think we've probably done this to death now and hammered on this more than a little, particularly given, as Cheryl said, and this matches my experience, by the way, the data for Shropshire is very good and that ultimately stems from yourself. But the kind of main responsibility for the different employers is to make sure that we have the correct data. All the things we talked about before are going to feed into this, having the correct pay, correct hours and so forth, submitted leaver forms on time so we know who's a current member, who's a former member, all that stuff, just to make sure that the benefits are correct. Then in terms of what the fund is doing currently, I guess the short answer would be a lot of work. They've established a working group to look into this. There's firstly data validation and cleaning relating to general operations, also the McLeod remedy, all the things we've talked about. All got to be gone through, passed and made sure it's correct so that when members do log into this, what they see is correct and appropriate. Because as I say, to have the wrong stuff in there is going to be kind of worse than nothing. Currently as well, they've got to look at a service provider. So how this works is the fund will partner with a service provider who will take their data and put it into a format that can then talk to the dashboards. So the fund is currently considering who the appropriate service provider might be. Updating stakeholders, a lot of people have a say in this, making sure members, employers, yourselves, the committee, the board are all up to date, making sure that all the standards are met. Obviously, in terms of setting this up and then ongoing oversight, there's going to be a lot of that from the pensions regulator, from the FCA. And so the fund is making sure that all the infrastructure is in place so that everything it does is done properly and securely, and so that the members can rely on it. So as I say, it's quite a significant piece of work there. And so that is an overview of dashboards. Oh yes, finally, there's further guidance awaited for the LGPS on this in more detail.
Hi, Mark.
So that's
I'm back.
Oh, excellent.
I do apologise, everybody. My system just decided to go black on me with no warning. So I'd panicked to try and get back on, but I'm sorry, I made it just in time for my section.
Terribly unprofessional, but we'll deal with that later.
Welcome back, Jonathan. We've got no questions as of yet at the moment. So do you want me to launch the next poll before you go into the next part?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Give me a second while it loads. So on those results, Jonathan, 75% have got a fully implemented policy and 23% say they haven't, but they are currently developing one, and then 3% for the other three.
Okay, thank you. So Mark, if you want to move the slides along. So just before we get on to sort of covering a little bit on cyber security in this section, first of all, just wanted to give a brief overview of some of the changes that have taken place this year in relation to pension taxation. Hopefully some of you on the call will be familiar with these, either as sort of a member of the fund if you are in the fund, or through sort of just general communications issued and what's been in the news, etc. So firstly, in terms of the lifetime allowance, so the lifetime allowance is the amount of benefit that members can accrue over the lifetime of their pension provision, assessed on retirement. And then previously, if members reached that limit on retirement, they were subject to potential extra tax charges if they didn't have any protections in place. From April 23 this year, in the spring budget that was announced in March, the tax charges now for members breaching the lifetime allowance have been abolished. So that was one of the key changes that came through in that spring budget. Just moving on, Mark. The other sort of main tax on pension provision is the annual allowance. So that's what we mentioned previously in terms of the amount of benefits members can accrue in the fund in one particular year. If that breaches the annual allowance, then those members can be again subject to tax charges if they don't have protections from prior years on carry forward, as it's called, in place. The limit up to April 23 was £40,000 a year. That went up in the spring budget to £60,000 a year, so quite a substantial increase in the amount of benefit members can accrue before incurring tax charges. Tax-free cash sums on retirement, historically up to this year, they were sort of linked to the lifetime allowance, and typically a quarter of the relevant lifetime allowance value. Now from April 23 onwards, that figure's now being frozen at £268,275, which was a quarter of the lifetime allowance that was in force as at sort of the 5th of April 2023. For some members, if they've got a protected lifetime allowance figure or protected cash amounts, that may differ, but for the majority of members, the lifetime allowance or the tax-free cash sum on retirement now is frozen at that level there on the slide. And then finally, just in terms of the changes that came through earlier in the year, so this one, whereas the lifetime allowance and the annual allowance impacts all members, or mostly the higher paid members or those with long service, etc., the annual revaluation date for care benefits does impact all members in the fund. And essentially, as we've shown on some of the earlier slides, the current benefit structure in the LGPS and other public sector schemes is to have a career average benefit, which is based on the pay that you earn in that particular year and the 49th accrual. And that pension then increases with inflation over the period to retirement. Now, for active members, there would be an inflationary increase on that pension historically on the 1st of April every year for the pension built up to the 31st of March. Now, earlier this year, that date got changed from the 1st to the 6th of April and will carry on now being the 6th of April every year. And if we just click on Mark, the main reason for that really was to avoid a substantial number of members being hit by the annual allowance in the year to 2023 that maybe otherwise have been hit by annual allowance charges in the past. Reason for that, obviously, no surprise, is the high inflation that we're currently seeing at the moment. So had there not been a change to that care revaluation date, the 10.1% inflationary increase that members saw on their benefits would have come through prior to the tax year finishing and would have put a lot more members over the £40,000 limit, and they're potentially subject to tax charges. And that was never policy intent really in terms of when the annual allowance was brought in and the sort of the inflationary increase impact of it within the calculations. So public sector schemes, not just the LGPS, all changed to the 6th of April, so effectively aligning the tax year with the care evaluation date, and that's substantially reduced the number of members breaching the annual allowance this year than otherwise would have come through. In terms of the annual allowance, obviously we've shown there it's going up from 40,000 to 60,000 from this tax year onwards. So again, there's probably going to be fewer members actually being breaching the annual allowance going forwards, but there will still be some members with long service, with promotions during the year or high inflationary pay rises that will still come through and potentially breach in terms of the amount of benefit accrued in that year. The removal of the lifetime allowance and also the annual allowance changes, it does give members more freedom now in terms of their benefits in the LGPS than there were previously in relation to tax. Some members may opt to buy extra pension through additional pension contributions. They may opt to pay additional voluntary contributions, AVCs, again, not with having sort of the knowledge that they're by building up more benefit, they're not going to be subject to potential tax charges in the future. And there may be some members who have opted out in the past of the fund if they were sort of worrying about breaching these tax limits, or maybe went into the 50-50 section of the scheme where you accrue sort of half the benefits compared to the normal benefit. And again, the sort of options are available for these members now to maybe think about coming back into the scheme or back into the full scheme from the 50-50 scheme. And whilst the lifetime allowance tax charges were abolished from April this year, it's going to take a little while until the lifetime allowance is actually abolished formally in regulations. So there's a bit more thought to how that actually is abolished going forward. So there's no tax charges being levied at the moment, and from April next year, the lifetime allowance will be abolished in full. And there was a consultation that came out in the summer and some draft legislation to try and sort of how that will happen in practice, and we're just awaiting a response to that consultation now. Obviously, it's not it has never been for a long time, probably sort of a simple situation in terms of pension taxation. So it's important for members and yourselves, if you're in the fund, but obviously your staff and your employees again, to be aware of these changes. And sort of it's a personal taxation. This ultimately, it's not, the fund can provide information and some guidance, but can't give members advice in these situations. And I know the fund has held a webinar recently for some members and HR representatives around this. So but the onus is really on sort of employers and members to sort of try and sort of become aware of what these changes, and then look at the information that's available and how it may impact them going forwards. And of course, we've had a lot of change this year, but there's still maybe more changes ahead in this area. And so I think at the moment, the Labour Party, when the spring budget came through, have said that they would reverse some or all of these changes should they get into power. So again, it's a bit of a watch this space going forward to see what happens there in practice. Whilst there may not be any retrospective changes, there may be some future changes in this area. So again, repeating that message around importance for members and employers and to be aware of what happens when it comes through and the implications of that. And of course, the fund will assist where it can in that process. Yeah, thanks, Mark. Just move on to the next slide. So the next couple of slides is just something to give you an overview of what's happening sort of centrally across sort of all pension funds and in the LGPS on governance matters. Some of these areas may not necessarily directly impact yourselves as employers, but in terms of what you do on a day-to-day basis, but it will impact on how the fund is governed going forward. So 2021, the pensions regulator published a consultation on a new code of practice, which was sort of aimed at consolidating lots of different codes of practice that were already there into one web-based code. It was originally referred to as the single code of practice, and now it's going to be referred to as the general code in terms of consolidation and clarifying the existing codes that were in place. As part of that, though, the introduction of the general code, funds will be required to have an effective system of governance and effectively set out how they operate and govern their funds, and also alongside that carry out an own risk assessment. So actually have an independent assessment of how the fund is actually governed, and that's in line with sort of the regulator expectations, and the LGPS is amongst those bodies who will be subject to this across all public and private sector funds. We've been waiting this for a while after the initial draft came through a few years ago. It's been expected probably throughout this year to come into force, but now we're hearing that it'll be 2024 when this comes through. Alongside this, and some of you may have heard about this from previous forums, etc., the Scheme Advisory Board, who oversee the LGPS, they've been working on their own good governance project for a few years and have gone through consultations and an exercise to actually come up with a sort of list of recommendations for LGPS funds alone in terms of how the fund is governed. Now, a lot of these areas in the Scheme Advisory Board project are aligned with what's coming through in the effective system of governance from the regulator in terms of conflicts of interest, representation, knowledge of understanding, service delivery, etc. Again, we're expecting a final consultation on these recommendations to come through in 2024, and that to become effective in 24. So there's a lot of work already being done in these areas, and to some extent, most funds will probably be doing this already and sort of meeting the requirements already of these extra governance exercises and sort of policies, etc. But at the same time, there's still work that can be done now in terms of training stakeholders, sort of notifying yourselves, committee, board members of what's to come, looking at what policies funds currently have, and I know the Shropshire Fund has done some of this already in terms of do we have enough policies in place? Do we need extra policies to meet these requirements? Do we need to review or amend what we've got already if they're sort of been done a few years ago? So there's a lot of work that funds can be doing now in working towards these meeting these extra governance requirements going forwards. Just move on, Mark, please. Just quickly on this slide here, in terms of governance and what is a system of governance. So effectively, it's anything that can be reasonably be considered part of the operation of a pension scheme. And for those of you who are familiar with pension schemes, and obviously we've shown and highlighted a lot of issues today that the fund has to deal with. There's a lot of different things that have to be considered in terms of how the fund operates, and therefore what might form part of an effective system of governance that the fund will need to establish, and some of the key areas that will need to be reviewed. So just the graphic on the slide, if you just click on, Mark, it will effectively cover some of these main areas, some of these sort of individual codes within the general code in terms of management of activities, how meetings are held, how stakeholders are trained, what pay policies are in force for sort of chairs of committees and officers, etc. In terms of organizational structure, the different roles within the organization and who's responsible for what, and how conflicts are managed. Investment matters. Obviously, a big part of the pension fund is the investment side, which I know we haven't sort of focused on in detail today, but there's the decision making. Climate change will go in there as well in terms of how those risks are managed. Communications and disclosure, again, what goes out to members, when that goes out, and again for yourselves as employers, how you sort of communicate and liaise with the fund. The pensions admin strategy, and I know the Shropshire Fund currently has a formal strategy in place. That will be now a requirement of all funds as part of these changes. So again, the Shropshire Fund meets that at the moment. Some funds don't necessarily have that strategy in place, and will have to produce one going forwards. And internal controls, again, linked to yourselves in terms of the transactions and how contributions are recorded that come in from yourselves, and sort of those financial transactions and how systems are managed, and again, business plans and continuity, etc. So there's a lot of different elements to how the fund operates. A lot of this, as I say, will be ticked off already in terms of the good work that the fund is doing, but there's a lot more focus coming forwards in terms of having this documented and being able to show to external bodies, and again, as part of those risk assessments and reviews, that the fund does have this in place and is meeting those requirements. So that's something that you'll probably see a little bit more of going into 2024 when further details are released and becomes effective. Okay, just in this sort of update on cybersecurity, and I know we ran the poll at the start there in terms of, does your organisation have its own policy? And most of you have said yes, you do have a policy, or at least it's being worked on. So that's good to know, really, because cybersecurity is something that we see in more and more focus on, and going forwards, it's not going to go away. So this slide here just sort of will give a quick overview for those who might not be too familiar with cybersecurity and what potentially what risks and events could take place. So we've just covered sort of 4 different areas on the slide here. The first being business interruption. So this may be where there's an attack against the pension fund systems, for example. Say we've talked about the administration software. So something that might happen, whether it's an attack or maybe just a natural cause or an error. And again, I've had a business interruption during this session today with my laptop just decided to shut down. But obviously, for a pension fund, for the systems to shut down, that can have big implications on the operation of the fund and sort of payment of pensions, etc. So an example there of business interruption. The next example which show is ransomware. And again, this is something that you'll probably be familiar with in terms of what you've seen in the news, where systems can become encrypted and users can be locked out of their own systems and data potentially can be stolen. And there's obviously maybe a situation where there's a ransom obviously levied on the holder of that data to restore those systems and not disclose data. So again, this is something that is real. These attacks do take place, and there have been events during the year involving pension funds. So it is something that the fund is aware of, and obviously yourselves as employers will need to be sort of vigilant to as well. Data breach is sort of the next sort of potential event that could take place, and there could be a multiple ways that a data breach can happen. Something can simply be emailed to the wrong person, so it could be sort of a breach in that sense. Or again, you could have attackers coming through via maybe potential ransomware or other areas where they access systems and can steal personal data, whether it's your end as the employer or the pension fund or the admin software. So data breaches, again, something we are seeing, and it doesn't necessarily have to be an external hacker. There are instances of where if people have been sacked for some reason, they may seek to take revenge on their organization before they leave. So that again, there are sort of different risks associated with cyber. It's not just sort of hackers that you might hear about in the news, etc. And finally, sort of just another sort of example scenario in terms of cyber-enabled fraud. So this again could be situations where emails are compromised or something that you requested change of bank details, etc., or in terms of diverting a payment from one party to another. I was on a call yesterday where an example involving a council, not in the Shropshire Fund, but there was a live example of where an organisation had their email hacked into. The council were making a payment to this organisation, and then the hacker emailed the council back to ask for the change in bank details for this payment. I mean, it was quite a substantial payment to be sort of diverted elsewhere. Now, luckily in that situation, the person on the receipt of that email did smell a rat and did sort of follow the correct procedures and raise that, and they got in touch with the organisation, and they knew nothing about this change, and that obviously led to the thing being shut down. So again, these are real events and things are taking place. So it's just purpose of that slide really just to sort of make you aware of the different types of events to be sort of vigilant to going forwards. Why is that important for pension schemes in terms of cyber risk? There's sort of three main areas of focus really for pension schemes in relation to cyber risk. So the regulatory and the regulators. We've talked, you'll know about the pensions regulator, and I've mentioned on the previous slide sort of the introduction of the general code of practice from 2024 onwards, and within the general code there's going to be a specific cybersecurity module within there. So again, it's recognized by all external bodies and the regulators that this is an increasing area of importance for pension funds, and again the fund needs to be aware of that going forwards and in what it does to meet the regulatory requirements. Data, we talked about data today in terms of liabilities and benefits, but obviously pension fund has a lot of sensitive member data flows and storage of that member data. Obviously 100,000 or so members, both actives, deferreds and pensioners, all sort of address details, contact details, etc. So for all pension funds, not just the Shropshire Fund, there's a lot of sensitive member data, and obviously that is attractive to hackers in some instances. So member data being a key area for pension funds. And finally, the third area really is in terms of third parties. The pension fund is a big operation, as we've said. It's not just the council that operates this. We have transfers of data from yourselves as employers to the council, and those flows of information about employer situations as well. It's not just necessarily member data. There's the administration and the software providers who store that data on the systems. There's ourselves as the actuary who receive data for calculations. It's not just member data as well. There's also the investment data, the asset data, and those payments and transactions on the asset side. So pension funds have significant exposure to a lot of different third parties. So it's important to understand what policies are in place for those third parties, etc. So again, it's good to see the response to the poll there in terms of your own organisations having policies in place. So that obviously will give some reassurance to the pension fund in that sense. So what is the fund currently doing in this area? So the current regulatory guidance in terms of the principles that they think funds should follow, that can be split into, those guidance principles can be split into probably three different areas: assessing the risk and understanding that risk, putting the controls in place, and obviously it's not something you just put the controls in place and put down. As with a lot of things, it's continuous monitoring and reporting of those risks. Going forwards, as I mentioned, the general code of practice would include a cyber module, and that has two main areas of focus in there in terms of assessing risk and managing risk. And a lot of the previous principles, the current principles as they are, and until the new code is in force, they're all very similar. But there is more of an emphasis going forwards on what happens when an attack occurs, not necessarily if attack occurs. I think there's a bit of a change in the stance from previous guidance a few years ago now, given the way that the things have moved on in this area. What the fund is doing, the fund's been sort of looking into this for a number of years now and sort of building on what they know is going to come through in the general code. We've been doing some work with the fund at the moment. The fund's trying to liaise with Shropshire Council as the host authority in terms of understanding what the council's policies are and what those procedures are. Again, the pension fund will have slightly different requirements, so it's again bringing sort of those aspects together with a view of sort of preparing the pension fund's policy document, which sets out what happens and what the fund needs to do in this area and what might happen if an attack occurs. And as we've mentioned, third parties are part of this process. The fund needs to understand what policies and procedures the third parties it deals with have in place and whether or not any sort of questions need to be asked about those policies. And yourselves as employees will have that flow of information to the fund. The admin provider, as we mentioned, will store that data. So it's important the fund understands what policies are in place, and it's not something that's going to be a surprise to any third parties. Again, this is a big topic across the whole sector and industry generally. So it's just having that information and knowing what's in place that's going to be important going forwards. What can you be doing as employers? Well, there's a few things really at the moment that you can do as an employer in terms of cyber hygiene with the pension fund. We've just shown an example here of an email from an employer, say to the fund, asking for a retirement quote to be processed for a member. It's given it's just, and you might think, oh, what's wrong with that? Well, obviously that email has a national insurance number in, the member's name in, the member's date of birth in, the member's pay figure in. So there's a lot of sensitive information relating to that member in that email. So again, a request not to send emails through to the fund in just as a sort of a simple email like that with that personal data in. And it's something that Mark and I do see, not necessarily in the Shropshire Fund, but we do see in some instances through, you can look down trails and you can see that those emails do still come through. So a request to just think about what's being sent to the fund, what you could be doing. Obviously, if there's any data coming through in spreadsheets, you can password protect those spreadsheets. If you have secure portals available through your organization, you can use those portals to sort of communicate that data. Again, that'll depend on sort of maybe the size of your organization and what systems you have. If the fund looks to send data, it will be sent using sort of Microsoft email encryption. And you as employees can then return or respond to those emails and send data back securely in that area as well. The iConnect system, which you should be familiar with, the fund informs me that that's been developed further, and sort of there are work is underway to actually include a secure portal within the iConnect system, and again that will facilitate the secure exchange of data with the fund. But again, just generally as individuals, there's lots of things you can do for your own cyber hygiene and just being aware of these potential events like we've shown. Undertaking any training that your organization may have, and I know Mark and I, we have to undertake training on a regular basis. I know the council does have training sessions, so if your organization does put those training sessions on, then we'd sort of recommend you sort of take and do those if they're not mandatory. Use of devices, again, just back to basics in terms of having laptops open on trains, and again just how data is transferred from one system to another. So there's lots of different things as an employer, but as individuals as well, that can be carried out here in terms of cyber hygiene going forwards.
Can I just check, sorry, before we move on to the next slide, Alison, Justin, how are we doing for time? Do we have time to do the last couple of slides?
Yeah, we're fine, Mark. We've got about another 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, we've got about another 10 minutes, yeah.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah, it should be fine then. Thanks, Mark. So the last couple of areas, just some general commentary, not necessarily Shropshire specific, in terms of what else is going on in the sector at the moment. I know we've talked about a lot of things today, but there are still sort of lots of other different areas being looked into within the LGPS that you may not be aware of. One of these is in relation to gender pay. So the Scheme Advisory Board commissioned the Government Actuaries Department to actually look into the average level of pension benefits accrued by male and female members. A report was published earlier this year, and on the back of that report, further analysis and investigation has taken place, trying to sort of try and understand maybe some of the patterns that were coming through in the outcomes of the analysis undertaken by the government actuary. So you can see from the chart there, average sort of actual pay levels, full-time pay levels, service. There is a gap between sort of male and female benefits and pay levels in terms of part-time and number of jobs held by particular members. So there are some obvious patterns coming through there, and it's not to say that there's actually active discrimination going on between sort of males and females, obviously illegal as that is, but I think given the availability of data now and sort of the overview that the Scheme Advisory Board has, and sort of those sort of paternalistic approach to looking after its members, the LGPS does have a predominantly female workforce, so there is a lot of work going on at the moment, and some things that just to sort of, I guess, keep an eye on. We'll see what happens out of the working groups that are being established to sort of what might happen going forwards. And I think key part of this is really in terms of the career patterns and different characteristics of employers and how that actually might filter through into those benefit levels. So something just to sort of in general commentary there, that there is that central analysis going on in this area, and something maybe of interest to yourselves personally or as an employer, and see what happens going forwards as that continues. And then finally, just before we move on to sort of the closing slides, take a breath, because there is a lot going on in the LGPS. There's always a lot going on in the LGPS, and again, some of these areas you might not be familiar with, given sort of your roles and sort of how you sort of keep up to speed with these areas. We haven't really touched upon investments today, but that again, obviously, alongside the administration of the fund and the finance and our side as the actuary, there's the investment side. There's a lot of going on the investment front. There was a consultation on pooling that came out recently in terms of how the pools may evolve going forwards, different ways of sort of asking funds to transfer assets into the funds and at what speed, some ways to support the levelling up agenda, which I'm sure you've heard of in the news in terms of what the government's trying to do, and different types of investments as well that LGPS funds can sort of help the government meet its own sort of targets going forwards on investment. So a lot going on investments. We're still awaiting responses to those consultations to see what happens next. In terms of Sharia law compliance, again, this is something similar to the gender pay gap, that something that was raised brought to the attention of the Scheme Advisory Board, and in terms of how the LGPS operates, and is there any potential sort of discrimination when the unlawful discrimination in how it's the benefit structure or the investments in terms of Sharia law. So they've had council advice. The Scheme Advisory Board has commissioned an independent Islamic scholar to actually go through the whole of sort of the LGPS and how it operates, and an initial report has been produced in that area, and we now await sight of the final report and sort of any recommendations and further legal advice. So again, that's something that is being looked at at a general level, in terms of making sure that the scheme doesn't have any unlawful discrimination in there and is fit for purpose for all members potentially going forwards. Cost management. Again, Mark mentioned this briefly in his section on McLeod, in that there are central processes whereby across all public sector schemes, they will look at the cost envelope. How much does the scheme cost? Does it fall outside of a particular sort of target level of cost? And if it does, what happens then in terms of how benefits are changed going forwards to bring the cost back into that envelope? There are different processes to look at for the LGPS, one from the Treasury, HMT, one from the Scheme Advisory Board, but they have evolved those processes recently in terms of how that cost is assessed, and that may then obviously determine whether member benefits are increased or decreased going forwards. And as Mark mentioned, at the moment of McLeod costs are within the envelope, as it were, but within the assessment. There's a chance, obviously, McLeod costs may be a part of that judicial review taken out of that assessment. And again, some of these, of the firefighter and the British Medical Association, they've launched that review in the other public service schemes. I think the impact in those schemes is bigger in terms of cost implications, but as with all public sector schemes, if there's a change in one, it will feed through into the LGPS as well, I'm sure. So something just to be aware of going forwards. And again, we've not touched upon probably half of the things that are being looked at the moment in terms of ongoing work. There is change to sort of, as the fund needs to evolve in a different situation now with the economic outlook compared to a few years ago. There's a lot more employees in the fund. There's different ways of reporting. So there are a number of central sort of initiatives and working groups underway to consider how surpluses are managed. So where if you're an employer in a surplus position, some central guidance for funds how to deal with those situations going forwards. Academy conversions, again, some extra information out there for academies in terms of how the process is applied when they convert to academy status. So if there are, obviously, I'm sure there are some academies on the call today, but there's again some work going on around academy conversions and providing employers with more information in that sense. When the fund, in terms of its own reports, the annual report and accounts, some working groups underway to ensure more consistency across LGPS funds, a lot more work done now to compare one fund to another. So having consistent reporting just enables that comparisons to take place. And the funding strategy statement, again, that's something obviously Mark and I are involved with alongside the fund as part of the valuation process in setting the principles that we set contribution rates, how employers enter the fund or exit the fund potentially, and what calculations are carried out. And again, the guidance principles that all funds need to follow, they are being looked at the moment. It's not been reviewed for a few years. So there's a lot going on. The team at the Shropshire are working on a number of fronts, working very hard, and obviously support from yourselves as employers is key to that process, as we've set out today, in particular around sort of data provision and communication of employer events, etc. Just finally, then, just before we sort of take final questions, I know we've covered a lot of topics today, Mark and I. Hopefully it hasn't been too daunting for you, but has give you an overview of some of those key areas that do impact you and your members, your staff, and also just a reminder of your responsibilities to the fund and what the fund requires you to do. You're not alone in any of this. Obviously, there's the officers available to support you through the normal channels. Any queries can obviously come through Mark and I as well where necessary. But there are a lot of central materials available. The LGPS website has sort of support for employees in terms of guiding you on ill health retirements, that calculation of assumed pensionable pay that Cheryl mentioned earlier, where if members go on to absence, just giving a bit of guidance around there. And there are there's an employer section of that site to help you, and the link that is there on this slide here, which will obviously be circulated there after this session today. And again, the LGA, the Local Government Association, they run various training sessions for employers. Again, you can dial into and then sign up to give you that background knowledge if you are new to this, or it's something you just want a refresher of the various areas, and some of the examples there are covered on this slide. So you aren't alone as employers. We obviously, the fund appreciates you coming onto the call today. Obviously, giving you the background information can only help going forwards in what you need to do. So I think we'll pause for any final questions, and feel free to raise anything. There's no wrong question to ask here in the Q&A or through the chat, or raise your hand in old school terms. But yeah, Mark and I would like to thank you for listening today, and my apologies again for disappearing unexpectedly halfway through. But did manage to get back on and go through this. So hopefully not too much has been lost.
That's great. Thank you both. Are there any final questions from anyone? I can't see any.
There's none in the chat or the Q&A, Justin, so unless anybody's got anything they want to ask, no.
Nothing.
They're a quiet bunch today.
Okay, that's fine. Obviously, if you want to submit any questions to the officers after the event, that's or to Mercer, that's absolutely fine. Just send them through, and we will ensure that all the slides are sent over to you with all the information in. Yeah, thanks for everybody for attending today. Thanks for your time. And I wish you a good rest of the day. So thanks everybody for joining.
Well, there's a lot of thank yous gone in the chat, so I think it's obviously gone down quite well, so that's good.
Thanks,
I did wonder where you'd gone, Jonathan. You suddenly...
So did I.